The mental health and well-being of the education workforce has an enormous impact on the whole sector. It can help to think about these effects and how they relate to each other across different levels of the system through an ecological framework. So if we start at the first level, we're thinking about the biggest frame of reference here for education, and that's the social and economic relevance of it. Well, when we think about well-being, we know that it matters economically because the aggregate impact of the continuity and the quality of the available teaching ultimately affects human capital and indeed national competitiveness. And that continuity and quality of teaching is, of course, affected by presenteeism and absence, in turn related to mental health and well-being factors. And so in that sense, it is relevant at the highest level of society. We also know that it impacts social mobility. There is good evidence in the literature that high teacher turnover has a disproportionately significant impact on pupil outcomes, particularly in more deprived areas. So it's not equally experienced, and those children in the poorest communities will be most impacted by teacher absence or teacher presenteeism. There's also the social effect. And I think this is something for us all to give considerable thought to. If most children are spending a significant chunk of their lives in environments that have higher than normal levels of stress, then ultimately, how will that shape our society? We know from the research and the evidence that stress levels in schools are higher than those experienced by the general population. And I think this question of how it will affect this generation of children and young people is probably a very important one for us to give consideration to. And in Wales, we know that with the advent of the new curriculum, this is driving how education policy is being shaped, and we're delighted to see that. When we come down a level and think about the education sector, then our attention immediately goes to the retention and recruitment of talented teachers and school leaders, and recognizing that this is often affected by well-being issues. Stress and poor working conditions are consistently cited by those who leave the profession. And based on workforce analysis that was done by Deloitte and Touche as part of the Thriving at Work work, we estimate that around 2% of the annual education budget is lost each year to the costs and reduced performance that arise from mental health, absenteeism, and presenteeism. So again, the level of the education system, this stuff matters. When we come to the level of the individual school, in many ways, it's much more familiar for us to see what the relevance of well-being and mental health might be. At the level of school, we know that each school is different and that much of this difference is determined by leadership and culture. A strong focus on relationships, a focus on building collegiality between members of staff, and on easily sharing appreciation and having an open culture and environment. We know, again, through research, that this is the sort of environment within which education staff will flourish. Education staff thrive on collegiality, and they get into their work, of course, because of the impact that they want to make on children and young people and on society, but also because by and large, they're quite relational individuals. A strong focus then on that is what will enable staff to flourish. But in the opposite type of culture, we think about environments that are hierarchical, more command and control, or particularly data or task focused. That sort of environment doesn't create a satisfying work environment for school staff. And that matters because staff satisfaction is linked to morale and to motivation. In a culture where staff feel supported and encouraged, they're likely to perform better than they otherwise would. So all else being equal, this leads to better teaching and learning outcomes for the whole school community. And of course, the health and well-being of leaders themselves has to be considered. The best leaders role model good self-care and make it safe to discuss mental health and well-being. This isn't about paying lip service to it, though. This is about leaders attending to their own well-being and recognizing that good self-care is part of good professional practice. And then we get to the level of the classroom. There's plenty of research that tells us that the teacher-student relationship is key. It's a key influence on pupil outcomes. I guess our contention in this, when we think about the significance of staff well-being is that the social interaction in the classroom of a stressed, overwhelmed, under-supported teacher is going to be very different from that of a supported teacher who has a strong sense of professional autonomy and self-efficacy. Pupils are unlikely to be best served by a desensitized and emotionally exhausted workforce. And finally, we get to the individual teacher or member of support staff, learning assistant, the individual member of the school staff team. And each individual matters. Personal resilience can be eroded by difficult experiences, and that includes, and again, plenty of evidence for this, being in an unhealthy workplace, being in a workplace that has poor leadership, where you have a lack of self-efficacy, a lack of that sense that you can make a difference through your work, a lack of colleague support. These issues directly affect people's personal resilience. And there's one thing when that happens in an acute way for a short period of time, but it's quite another when it's a chronic issue. Chronic stress is particularly problematic. It causes more severe health problems than short-term stressors, and that includes suppressing the immune function. Chronic work stress can lead to the degradation of the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain most active in memory, but also in regulating emotion. So this is really important for each individual who is affected by significant levels of workplace stress. And to make the point most starkly, the 2017 data from the Office of National Statistics indicated that the risk of suicide among nursery and primary teachers is 42% higher than the national average. That's a very sober statistic, and there's clearly a lot more work that needs to be done to understand that. But I guess it makes one point very clear: every individual matters in this ecosystem within the education system. Education is a social system. It's full of interrelationships, full of dynamics, feedback loops, unintended consequences, mess, complexity, humanity. We haven't even included parents, families, communities in our little illustration there. But I guess the point we want to make is this: staff well-being matters at every level of the education system.